After World War II, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, especially here in North America, began to go through sort of a metamorphosis. There was a lot of different changes that took place, and these changes eventually affected our work around the world. There was evangelism that came in that perhaps had not been done exactly that way before. Probably some of this was inspired by the 1949 crusade or campaign held by Billy Graham in Los Angeles. And then Fortis Dedamore came to this country back from the Orient, and he began doing the shorter campaign. This brought along a whole different period of evangelism in North America. Along with this, there were other things, CA, that happened that really made it an exciting time in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'm sure you remember some of those things.
Oh, some of those things are still very much fresh in my mind. I don't quite go back to World War II, a little bit later, but the advent or the re-emergence of public evangelism and some of these great meetings that were held. I love this Heritage series because it is a piece of living history.
Yes.
We get to interview men and women
who do go back to that World War II era.
Do indeed go back to that time, and who shaped a lot of what we almost take for granted in the Adventist Church today. And the interviewee of today is no exception. Cyril Miller. Yes. This is the first one that we've interviewed that I don't know quite as well as you do. We have met, our paths have crossed several times. But what is interesting about this particular interview, Jim, is that I counted no less than 11 innovations that he has brought to the church that we take for granted now, that are pretty much part and parcel of the Adventist Church.
Correct.
But they had their genesis with him, and I didn't know that. And I would encourage our viewers to look for 11, at least 11 specific things that we take for granted. I'll give them one: combined budget.
Yes.
You know, that's common now. It started, came into vogue when I came into the ministry. We all do combined budget. Rather than having offerings for this and offering for that, we have a combined budget. I didn't know that was the brainchild of Cyril Miller.
Yes.
Perhaps others, but the one who really put legs on it was Cyril Miller.
Yeah.
And so there are at least 11, and perhaps more, and you know him so very well. Wonderful man of God.
Absolutely. It has had a great impact upon my own personal life, and so many others that he started in the work. You're going to hear people like Doug Batchelor, and the impact that Cyril Miller had on ministries like Amazing Facts, like the Revelation seminars that we have today that are so well accepted. So many of these things, he was very much a part of them.
Yes.
And they came out of his fertile brain.
Very fertile brain.
In so many instances.
Yeah.
This is a man who loves the Lord, has dedicated his life totally to the ministry. When a lot of ministers can barely wait until they're 65, or at least have got enough years in that they will be ready to retire. And when he retired, I'm trying to remember exactly how many years it was that he had in, but it was way over the 40. It's more like the 50 years of active service that he had at that time.
What a generous, godly man. He would not mind us telling he is 80 now.
Yes.
But just a regal man of God, and again, one who is foundational in so many aspects in the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America.
And you know, really, in a real sense, he is not retired.
Yeah.
He continues to give counsel to ministers and to be available whenever he is called upon. I know of a situation where a church was in very heavy debt. They did not have any idea how to get out. Cyril went and sat down with them and began to talk to their leaders, and they found that money within their own resources to pay off that debt.
Yeah. The setting, of course, for this is Richardson, Texas.
Yes.
Your stomping ground, dare I say, during the Doug Batchelor meetings. And we got a chance to read a real fine pillar in the Church of God.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
And we are going to move along now to Richardson and to our discussion with Pastor Cyril Miller. few months ago, Pastor C.A. Murray and I began a series called the Heritage Series. This is a series where we talk to individuals who are still living today that have been real impact players, we might say, in the church during the time of great growth that we've had since the early 50s. And we have one of those today. And C.A., it's a real privilege to have Elder Cyril Miller with us, isn't it?
It is. We have had a chance to meet and dialogue with some fabulous men,
Yes.
greatly used of God, and Elder Miller certainly falls in that category of men who have been used by God, who have dedicated their lives to God. You never really retire from the Adventist ministry. You may slow down, you may retread, but you don't really retire. And Elder Miller is still busy today, and we are glad that he was able to take some time out to talk with us.
Well, he's a great friend of mine, someone that's had a big impact in my life. And so I'm especially honored that we can be here with him. And Elder Miller, we welcome you to our Heritage Series.
Thank you, Jim.
And when I found out we were going to be in Richardson, Texas, here at the Richardson Church, Pastor Paul Hunt is the pastor, I said, listen, we've got to talk to Elder Cyril Miller while we're there as part of our Heritage Series. So, Elder Miller, life began for you in Oklahoma, I believe.
Yes, February 10, 1928.
Wow.
Born in a little village called Preston.
Right after that, they had the Depression, I think.
The Great Depression of the 30s. And my mother was a widow, single parent.
Yeah.
Difficult days during the Depression. She had to work 2 jobs to keep food on the table. She worked in a doctor's office in a town 8 miles away. And we had a telephone office in our home.
Is that right?
Yeah, big switch. Looked big to me. It was a switchboard for the community.
Sure. I remember some of those, and also the operator was able to listen in on the conversations if they so desired.
If they desired. I don't remember her ever doing that.
Well, I know that she didn't, but were you ever tempted, or your
I was
brother?
too little. I couldn't reach the cords.
All
Now, that was right in your home.
In our home,
Yeah.
in our front room.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And the company put that there in your home?
That's right.
Well, they had these little telephone companies,
Yes.
and then they all were kind of part of the mother company.
Correct.
But they were small companies.
That's incredible.
And during those difficult days, my mother used to pray for a home that had running water and an indoor toilet.
Wow. Listen, having lived without either of those 1 year with Camille and I, our first year of marriage, I can understand why she was praying for that.
So you had to go and get water and bring it in, and of course you had the privy outside.
Yes. My mother remarried, and we had a neighbor live next door, and she was the kitchen cook for a work train. And she told my mother, says, you need to meet my boss. And so she arranged for them to get together. And he was the director of this work train, bridge building train. And he proposed, and we moved to his town.
Is that right? Where was that?
Well, it was at Sapulpa, near Tulsa. It's a bedroom community of Tulsa.
Yeah.
And there we had running water and an indoor toilet. So our prayers were answered.
How did you become an Adventist?
Well, it's very interesting. My mother became ill. Didn't know what it was. Adventist neighbor living a block down the street heard about it, came down to take care of her. And so we 3 children said, let me take these children to Sabbath school. And that's how it started.
Wow, that's amazing. So did she go to some meetings, or?
Yes, mother studied. Mother was searching. And she discovered that the Sabbath was changed from Saturday to Sunday. She said, I just don't know about that. And so she'd been in a Catholic boarding school as a girl. She said, I'm going to go talk to the priest. So we got in the Whippet. We had a 28 model Whippet that sat in the garage all week long till my dad came home, my stepfather, on weekends. And it was new in the 30s. That was still a new car. So we went down to the Catholic church. She went in, talked to the priest, came back and said, the Sabbath was changed. They claimed that they did it.
Wow.
Incredible.
She said, I'm joining the Adventist Church.
Wow.
So she ran into an honest, truthful Catholic priest.
Oh, yes, he bragged about it.
That simply said yes. Right.
But shortly after her baptism, she went to a TB sanitarium. Her illness was diagnosed tuberculosis.
Wow.
And we children were sent, my older sister, my younger brother, and I, to live with my grandmother and her husband, who were in Missouri. And she was a doctor, medical doctor, and he was the pastor of the Methodist Church. So we were the preacher's kids.
Right.
But you were already baptized in the Adventist Church by the time you got into this Methodist household.
I was still just a child when we went to Missouri.
So how long were you in Missouri?
About 2 years.
Okay.
And we returned to Oklahoma, and I went to church school. And the Adventist Church we operated a school in the basement of our church. That sounds kind of dreary, but it wasn't. It was a ground level, lower floor. The sanctuary was up a flight of big stairs, you know, like the Methodist Church used to build so many.
Right.
And that's where I went to school through all my elementary years.
Wow. And this is where you learned really about the Seventh-day Adventist beliefs.
Oh my, yeah. I developed a worldview of Adventism by attending. I learned about our mission and our message. Our church school teachers really emphasized that.
Yeah.
And the MV Society and summer youth camps. And I can remember awakening. My mother's tuberculosis left her crippled. She was an invalid. She only had one lung. They collapsed one of her lungs. And I hear her wake up in the middle of the night, hear her pleading with God, let me live long enough to raise my children.
So then when were you baptized?
I was baptized at the age of 12.
Okay.
And some say that's how old Jesus was when he was baptized.
Yeah.
I was baptized in the Old Tulsa Church, and I continued attending church school. My boyhood was like a Norman Rockwell all-American childhood. We just, you know, lived in the good old days.
Yeah. It seems like, looking at your past, although you went back and forth a little bit, Oklahoma, Missouri, back to Oklahoma, your memories and being in a single-parent home, your memories were good ones. It seems like it was a happy
all the way
childhood.
through.
Yeah.
We had a happy home wherever I was. And that's been my fortunate experience. I've never been anywhere where I was unhappy. And the Lord is blessed.
When you, I understand the church school closed and you started going to public school. Did you get involved in some of the activities of the public school?
The public school was like the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There was both good and bad there. And I played basketball and baseball, and I was president of the student body, and I also participated in the drama and the debate. I was on the debate team, never lost a debate, had lots of friends, but never did I go to any events, maybe once, on Friday night or on the Sabbath.
So for the most part, you held on to your faith even during those days.
Always. And I was entrenched. Now, when we went to high school, Mother said, we're going to have worship every morning, and she'd get the testimonies down and read to us. And I remembered the testimonies so that when I went away to Union, to college, and we'd have jam sessions, and I'd say, well, the Spirit of Prophecy says thus and so. I don't know where to find it right now, but it says this. It was indelibly impressed upon my mind.
Well, you know, I have a friend, Gary Grimes, who's also from Oklahoma, and he tells me that you were an outstanding athlete and that you're an all-state baseball player.
Well, yes.
And had a tryout with the Pittsburgh Pirates.
The Pirates held a training camp, and I went to that, and the scout who was from Oklahoma, his name was Warner. He and his brother were two of the very few in those days that had more than 3,000 hits in their career. And he was called Little Poison. His brother was called Big Poison. And they had 3,000 and 5,000 hits between them. He wanted to sign me up with the Pirates right then and there. And I said, no, I want to go to the university. I want to go to college. And my ambition was to study law and get into politics.
So where did you go to college?
Well, he said, I'll work it out for you to get a scholarship. He said, the coach at University of Oklahoma is my friend.
Yeah.
He said, I'll get you a scholarship. You play for them. And he said, but if you decide not to go to college, he said, get in touch with me. And he said, I'll take you to Florida to our spring training camp. And that's where they took all the best prospects.
Yeah.
And that's where Mickey Mantle went and broke in.
So this was a bona fide offer. This was
Bona fide
they
offer.
Really sought you hard.
Yeah.
Was Mickey, was he a contemporary, Mantle?
Yeah, I saw Mickey play as a teenager.
Is that right?
And I was coming through his part of the country. I stopped. I was going to try out for the team. His coach said, go out and hit a few in batting practice. I did. Got off some good ones. And he wanted to sign me up right there. The only drawback is they wanted me to work in a lead mine.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, it was amateur baseball.
Yeah, semi-pro.
But I saw Mickey that night, and boy, oh boy, he was playing shortstop. I've never seen a shortstop cover the territory that he did.
Right.
But he made errors. That's when they moved him to the outfield.
That's right.
He could hit the ball hard, and he was reputed to be the fastest man in baseball.
Yeah. Well, then after you had this experience...
I got home that summer, and the church, there was a big North American Division Youth Congress scheduled for San Francisco later in the summer. And my church put together some funds that said, we want you to be our delegate. And so they sent me out there to this youth congress. And I got out there, and there were thousands of young people. I was very much impressed. And an appeal was made on Sabbath to study for the ministry, to become a pastor. And I stood up and made a decision for the ministry, and went directly to Southwestern Junior College
in those days,
in Keene. Yeah, that's what it was called.
I want to back up just a moment, because I think it's interesting that the Lord called you to ministry.
Yes.
Right on the heels of that call to baseball.
Yes.
And I'm stopping here because there may be some young person out or someone who is thinking of the allure of a basketball scholarship or a baseball scholarship. Was there ever a time you must have thought seriously about, you know, they're dangling money, fame, Major League Baseball player, that had to be kind of alluring to you. You had to kind of weigh the fact because you're going to have to give up a lot as far as your faith is concerned to pursue that course.
I thought about it for many years afterward, but I never regretted the choice.
Praise God.
I went to Keene, worked my way through school, no scholarship, 12.5 cents an hour. And I lost 2 years of college because of a bone infection. I had osteomyelitis. And I lost 1 year in high school and 2 years in college. But I graduated from Union, began my ministry in Oklahoma. I learned evangelism from Milton Reber and Stanley Harris, rural evangelism from Reber, and Metro from Harris.
Yeah. Well, both of those were great workers. And Stanley Harris, of course, extremely well known as an evangelist. When were you ordained to the ministry?
Ordained in 4 years after I got
57.
out. 57, yeah, 1957.
Wow.
Everybody in Oklahoma knew me as a boy.
Yeah.
I was Cyril to everybody. And my district in Oklahoma bordered the Arkansas line, and across the line was the Ozark Academy. And I received a call to pastor the Ozark Academy Church right after my ordination. And immediately, overnight, when I crossed that line, I was no longer Cyril, but now I was Elder Miller.
Okay.
Yeah, Jim, something occurs to me, and we've seen this throughout all of the heritage that we've done, is that at some point in all of the lives of men who were, and I'm going to use the term successful, in the cause of Christ, there was a time when they had to make a defining decision.
That's right.
When they said, I'm going to step out for the Lord, even if it costs me something. And obviously it costs you a lot, from making money, having a scholarship, being a professional or at least semi-pro player, to going back to school at 12.5 cents an hour. So you made a decision that called for a certain amount of sacrifice. But the Lord, of course, was with you, and then once you make that decision, you know, God can then work with you. And I see that pattern again replicated
Right.
in your life.
And the amazing thing, C.A., to me, is that these people received a call. They saw it as a call from God, though sometimes it was a committee meeting. They felt it was from God, and I believe it was. And they accepted it and moved forward. Today, so many times we'll see a call come, and people will take weeks and maybe then turn it down. And the day in which you came up, when you received a call, you prayed about it, but you pretty much received it at that time, believing that the Lord had met with the committee and trusting in that decision. Yeah. And so you had that call to go to Gentry. Probably I.M. Evans was the president.
He was.
At that
Dear
time.
old gentleman.
Wonderful man.
Yeah.
And so they called
He would call me up about a week before camp meeting was scheduled, and he'd say, Brother Miller, would you put together a camp meeting program for us?
The brother would do that to you, you know. They drop it on you kind of sudden.
Well, you were always willing to do it. And
but it was never a sacrifice. I never considered it a sacrifice.
Well, if you went to a big church like Gentry, though, you must have had an enormous
Well, it was the
in-gathering
second
goal.
largest church in the Union.
Yeah.
And it had a large in-gathering goal. Remember, we used to go for the Minuteman goal.
Right.
But no territory.
Yeah.
And so we had to really work. And I'd go as far as Fort Smith, and I'd take carloads of young people, and they'd tag the soldier boys down there at the military base. And we came up the first year, and we were short over $1,000. And I told the church, and they gave the money.
Oh, yeah.
And we got our goal. First time in the history of the church.
Praise the Lord.
Wow. Well, after that, you received a call to go to the Southwestern Union.
That's right, Jim. I received a call to the Southwestern Union to be the stewardship and religious liberty director. It was just a great surprise. And a little later, I edited the Union paper. And while editing the paper, I wrote an article. Of course, as editor, I put it right on the front page.
Yeah.
And it said, Combined Budget, a new approach to fundraising. And the General Conference treasurer got that, and he protested. He said, they're pooling the funds down there in the Southwest. And Elder L.C. Evans, our union president at the annual council, defended me. He said a local church has the right to do what they want to do with their own money.
Right.
And in those days, it wasn't uncommon to have 2, 3, sometimes 4 different offerings on a Sabbath. And it was very obnoxious, for counterproductive to worship.
Right.
And so the treasurer said, the General Conference treasurer, he indicated that it would take money away from the tithe and the offerings. Well, we kept careful statistics and soon discovered that the more they gave to the local budget, the more tithe and the more offerings they had.
That's
the giving begets giving,
Yep.
as Ellen White says.
Well, then you also were involved with the Religious Liberty Department.
That was exciting.
Yeah.
Religious Liberty Department at the time of the Kennedy-Nixon campaign. When religious church and state was a major issue, and Sunday laws had popped out like popcorn all over the United States. Melvin Adams and Roland Hegstead of the General Conference Religious Liberty Department came down and coached me, mentored me, and when the campaign came, I got ready. And we developed a Liberty Bond. We had a $10 Liberty Bond and a $20 Liberty Bond, and it looked just like an official government-issued bond. And the offering that year jumped tremendously high.
Wow.
It was a super success, and the reason was, instead of dropping at 5 or a 10 in the offering plate, it triggered 10, 20, and I remember one fellow in the Dallas First Church came running down the aisle when we made the appeal. He had 5 $100 bills in his hands.
Isn't that something?
So the offering exploded and got the attention of the whole division.
Well, you also got the attention of the Columbia Union, and they called you to come there. A man by the name of Neil Wilson, I believe, called you.
So that is correct.
Yeah.
And so I prayed about that, was really hesitant. I loved the Southwest, didn't want to leave the Southwest. But I was told by one of the staff members on the union staff who was very close to me, I'd known him since a boy, Elder Nesmith.
Yeah.
He was the educational director of the Oklahoma Conference. He ran our youth camps and that kind of thing. He would come around to our church school, and the teacher would have us all to be clean, have our fingernails even clean, our desks clean. And I said, Elder Nesmith, what would you do? He said, I would take the call. He said, it'll broaden your experience.
That's right.
So I accepted the call.
Yeah.
And in the Columbia Union, I took Neil's job, Elder Wilson's job, bless his heart. He was the Religious Liberty Director, the Medical Secretary, and the ASI Secretary for the Columbia Union.
Elder, before we get too far away, I want to just step back because you kind of lightly passed over something that has revolutionized giving and systematic benevolence in the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Yes.
I recall the days when you could come to church and there would be 4 or 5 offerings
Yes.
on a given Sabbath.
Right.
And it would destroy the worship atmosphere because there were so many calls for money, all of them good departments, but it just changed the flavor of it. The idea of combined budget has revolutionized, Jim, I think you will agree with me,
absolutely.
has revolutionized giving in the church. I did not know till this moment that it had its genesis in your mind.
I was one of the pioneers.
Yeah, that's
And our
fabulous.
slogan was, put all your begs into one basket.
That is fabulous because I remember those days when there were so many calls for money. But that has really changed, and to know that you had an integral partner, that in itself is something that the Lord has greatly blessed the church with.
Well, since those days, I have served on hospital boards for about 40 years before retiring. And it became an important part of my life. ASI also. The first Liberty campaign in the Columbia Union, when I went to the Columbia Union, people said, now, Cyril, this is not the Southwest. This is not the Bible Belt. Things are different around here. Don't expect the same response that you got down there. And I thought, well, man, this must be tough. But I thought it over. I traveled around. I thought, these people are just like the people of the Southwest. And so I said, let's just pull out the same things and try them here. We did. And so we got ready with the Liberty bonds and for the campaign and a video that was very well done by Dr. Bevan, president of Columbia Union College. And so we sent those out. We met in the workers' meeting, taught them how to use them. And I personally itinerated and went to Richmond, Virginia. And in that meeting that day, there was a young man who was a student and for chaplain's training who was blind. His name was Bob Wilson. Bob gave $1,000.
Wow.
That was what was happening. It was amazing. And the offering came to nearly $250,000.
Praise God.
And it was $240,000 to be exact. And so then, you know, it really raised some eyebrows. Then they wanted to hold on to the money.
Yeah.
I said, no, this is to go to Liberty magazine. This is to go to other things. And I had to visit the conference offices to get them turned loose of that money.
Yeah. So now there were a lot of other things you were involved with as well as Liberty.
Yeah, in medical 5-day plan to stop smoking.
Yeah.
It had just burst forth out of nowhere, it seemed. Elman Falkenberg and Dr. McFarland. And the responses from the public were unbelievably large. Fantastic responses. We could go to a newspaper and say, we're having a 5-day plan. Would you assign a reporter? And they would assign a reporter to take the program and report it every day, puff by puff.
Yeah.
And we had one at the University of Maryland. We had one in a Catholic church there in the Silver Spring area. We had them in the major cities all across the Union, the great Columbia Union. And out in Cleveland, the Cleveland Clinic co-sponsored it with us. And that is a very famous medical center like Mayo's and some of the others. And newspaper reporters in all these places. We made front pages, and it was exciting.
Now, you were still in your 30s.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah. And it wasn't long, though, that they said, we want you to be the president of the Chesapeake Conference.
Yes, Chesapeake. I never knew where Chesapeake was until I went to Columbia Union.
Right.
Didn't know there was such a place.
Yeah.
But it became very dear to my heart.
Yeah.
Beautiful people, beautiful country.
Yeah.
And I became president. I remember Elder Wilson called me. There'd been a shuffle. They merged East and West Pennsylvania. And so one of the presidents stepped aside, and one of the two got that one. Or rather, one of them went to Ohio. The Ohio president came to the New Pennsylvania Conference. Chesapeake Conference had gone to New Jersey. And the man that was left out of the loop was Elder Keyes. And he was a good friend, as from a boyhood. He was a pastor in Oklahoma. And my pastor would take me with the ministers in pitch camp when I was just 14 years old. And Elder Keyes made me his boy Friday.
Yeah.
And I carried all of his steel stakes around and his sledgehammer. And he'd say, we're going to lay out a big tent. He'd measure, and he'd say, hold a stake here. And I'd hold those steel stakes, and he'd swing that sledgehammer wearing a pair of cowboy boots. And he never missed. I just had the utmost confidence Elder Keyes would never hit my hand. And so he was without a job. And I said, Elder Wilson, I can't accept this. I said, Elder Keyes should have this job. And he hasn't been placed. He said, we've already passed over his name. And he said, if you don't accept it, he said, somebody else will. And it won't be Elder Keyes. So I said, well, okay. And Elder Keyes took my job as Religious Liberty Secretary.
That's good.
And he came and he said, Cyril, tell me what to do. It's like I was when I was Boy Friday.
Yeah. Yeah, the roles had reversed.
Yeah.
Well, you probably, as you became president of that conference, found out they had a lot of money to spend. Is that right?
Well, let me say first, I was young and green.
Yeah.
And if I'd have known what I knew later, when I found out, when the treasurer told me that we were broke and we had no money, I might not have wanted it. But the Lord guided. It was 10 years after I got out of college that I was elected to be a president. I was 35 years of age.
Fast.
That is very
And I
fast.
was very green. I went around the general conference asking top men that I had utmost confidence in. And I asked Elder Carsage, I said, what advice would you have for a greenhorn? And he said, study the policy book. Study the policy book. You know how he used to talk.
Yeah.
And so I asked Elder M.V. Campbell, another vice president of the General Conference, whom I admired from Union College days when he was president of the Central Union. Well, he said, Brother Miller, before you ever go into a committee, have things pretty well thought through, so you won't have any surprises. And you can expedite things.
All of this was good counsel.
Very good counsel.
Yeah.
And I asked Brother Capman, who was president of the Potomac Conference. He was a good old gentleman, kind of folksy. He said, well, Brother Miller, don't make any promises you can't keep. And that was good counsel, too. Because they're always inclined to want to help people.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he said, don't make any promises you can't keep. So now we go back to the facing the Chesapeake Conference that is broke.
Yeah.
And I was a little bit deflated, and he said, we don't have any money to do anything with. And so I prayed about it, thought about it, and I thought, what shall we do? Shall we just drop the anchor? We were right there in the Chesapeake Bay area.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, what area did the Chesapeake Conference cover?
Oh.
What was your territory?
It was state of Maryland, with the exception of the close to the Washington, D.C. Beltway, and the state of Delaware, and part of West Virginia. We had their panhandle, and they had Maryland's panhandle, and a little tip of Virginia. And people would say, this is a lot like England.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
It's a beautiful part of the country.
And the people on the eastern shore of Maryland, that was across the Chesapeake Bay,
Yes.
many of them had never been to Baltimore. And it was like going to a foreign country to go to Baltimore. But our office was in Baltimore. It was in an old house. It was a rich man's home who had a fleet of merchant vessels. He could go up in the tower in the top of his home and look out and see his ships out there in the bay.
Ah.
And it was old. I mean, I tell you, it was getting old, but it was still nice enough.
Yeah.
But we outgrew it soon. So I said, what shall we do? And I was using the vernacular of the area. I said, should we just drop the anchor and lower the sails and wait for a better time? And I just seemed like the Lord said, no. Go forward.
Yes.
And so we did. And so things began to happen. I called the pastors together and I said, friends, we don't have any money, but we're going to use the Reuben Schneider plan. Now, Reuben Schneider was an evangelist, a solo evangelist, a one-man band type organization, just him and his wife. And he never had a budget. And he would go into a church and he'd say, we're going to spend about $60 for a nice card to announce our meetings and topics. And the only advertising we're going to have is you give them to your friends. Wow. And he had a crowd. He was a very dynamic preacher. He looked like Jack Dempsey and looked like somebody had hit him right, maybe Joe Louis had hit him in the nose. And he had run a haberdashery before he became an Adventist. And he dressed like he was a millionaire, a tycoon of some kind. When he'd go out on these trips, he'd have about 3 hat boxes and half a dozen suits and 4 or 5 pair of shoes. And he just looked, he said, he used to lecture to our workers and say, it's disgraceful for you men to be driving these Volkswagens. He said, you run around with your knees up against your chest, and it's totally undignified. So I said, we're going to use the Reuben Schneider plan. And his plan was spend no money, take an offering every night, even though you didn't spend any money. There will be a surplus. He said, let me take the offering, and there will be a surplus, and I'll turn it into the conference. So he'd hold a meeting, and we had many teams in those days. We had the Barron Brother teams, we had the Spiva Brother teams, we had Dedamore Turner team, and they all took big budgets. And he'd go into the conference, and he said, well, we baptized 25, or we baptized 18, and he said, we have $350 left over, and put an envelope on the desk of the treasurer. So he made money with evangelism. Yeah. And so when I announced that to the Chesapeake pastors, that we were going to use the Reuben Schneider plan, they just couldn't swallow that. They didn't believe it would ever work. And so they said, you show us how. So the shoe was back on my foot.
Yeah.
And one of the pastors, Paul Smith, he came up afterward and he said, Cyril, come to my church. We'll hold that meeting in my church. I said, well, where is it? He said, oh, across on the other side of the Chesapeake Bay. Things are very conservative over there. That's where the people, it was much like it was in the colonial era. Hadn't changed a whole lot. That's where a lot of people lived, and never been to Baltimore. So I said, okay. And so we went over there and had a little simple announcement, and the people came. And I took an offering every night, and we had a surplus, and we bought a big 12-foot movie screen for their new church.
Wow.
And they were excited, and we had 17 baptisms.
Praise the Lord.
Amen.
So I called the pastors back together in workers' meeting. I said, it works in Chesapeake just like it worked in the Southwestern Union. And let's use the Reuben Schneider plan. And that launched Crisis Hour Evangelism.
All right. Now, what was Crisis Hour Evangelism?
Well, at that time, the world was undergoing quite a few crises. There was one in the Congo, and there was one in the Middle East, and there was one somewhere else.
Now, what years are we talking about, Elder?
Oh, this was in the
mid-60s?
60s.
Oh, yeah. A lot of things going on.
Yeah. Unusual things.
Yes.
So it just looked, everything was tense. So we said, we're living in a crisis hour. We have to have special evangelizing to meet the crisis.
You became president the
Yes.
same year that Kennedy was assassinated,
Yes, I remember.
1963.
Yeah.
And then shortly during those years, there were so many things of that nature. That
The Cuban
that
crisis was one of them.
Right.
Right in there, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this was a crisis hour. So what happened then?
Well, the crisis hour evangelism was a method that I learned from Lawrence Nelson, who was the youth director of the Southwestern Union. Lawrence would go out and hold an evangelistic meeting, and he would preach all of our message, all of our doctrines, within the context of Bible prophecy. And people had quit coming out to hear doctrinal subjects. They say, this is what you believe, my church believes that. Didn't draw them anymore. And, you know, all those clever titles that we used to use, like shortbreads and narrow covers. All that just fizzled out. But they would come to hear prophecy. And he taught me how to do that. So I taught the Chesapeake pastors how to preach our message within the context of Bible prophecy. And that was crisis hour evangelism. And we raised about $40,000 at the camp meeting. We had a little money then. And we went out and baptized the equivalent of 10% of our membership, which was very unusual.
Yes.
Because they were saying that the days of evangelism are over.
All right.
Some of our General Conference brethren were saying the days of evangelism were over. You remember that?
I do remember that, and I remember how you and Bill May and Fortis Dedamore and some of these others were showing that it was not.
Don Gray was one of them.
Don Gray was one of those, that's right.
They've been trying to drive a stake in the heart of evangelism for a long time.
Yeah.
Many times they've announced the premature death of public evangelism, but it has a way of sticking around, you know.
It's God ordained. It's the first work of the church.
Precisely.
He organized the church for no other purpose
Right.
except to seek and save the lost.
Well, you know,
That's why we're here.
There's some people that believe it's either evangelism or education, that you cannot do both. How did you handle that?
Well, Highland View Academy.
Yeah.
Our Chesapeake members were sending their young people to Shenandoah Valley, to Blue Mountain, to Mount Vernon out in Ohio. They wanted their own boarding school. And we were a small conference when I went there, a little over 3,000. They didn't have the ability for a boarding school to build one and support one. And so we decided that we would do it in constituency meeting. And my coordinator of evangelism, Elder Bill May, he opposed it, very strongly opposed it. If you know Bill, if he was for something, he was for it. If he was against it, he was against it. And he came to me and he said, look, he said, I was in the Alabama-Mississippi Conference, and he said, we had a great soul-winning program going, and they started building Bass Memorial Academy. And he said, all of our pastors stopped doing soul winning and went to fundraising. And he said, it killed our soul winning program. Well, by that time, we had a good soul winning program going in Chesapeake. So he said, that's what'll happen here. And I said, no, Bill. The Lord wants us to do evangelism. That's the charter and the charge for the church.
Yes.
Those are our marching orders. That's God ordained. But the people here want their own academy. And if you just keep the soul winning program going as the coordinator, I'll raise the money for the academy, and I won't harness the pastors to do it.
Yeah.
Now, I went out on a limb, but I've discovered that you can't go out on a limb for God. When you do, He always takes care of you.
Amen.
He never lets you down.
Well, you bought some property up near Hagerstown.
Yes.
And
yes.
I've been there. I've been on that academy several times and preached at their camp meeting.
Yes.
And what a fabulous piece of property that is, Cyril. It's beautiful. And right next door to it is the youth camp. You got the youth camp there. I've spoken there as well. And then the academy. And everybody knows that it was during your ministry there that Highland Academy was built.
Well, it was thrilling. It was fun. My wife said it took 10 years off of my life, though. Said I looked 10 years older when it was over. But it was fun.
Yeah. Elder, the Lord was pleased to move you along fairly rapidly. You know, 10 years out of college, 35 you are a conference president. That is, it's not unheard of, but it certainly is rare.
That's right.
When, as you look back, what I'm seeing is God called you to be an innovator, to maybe kind of, to use the term, think outside the box, to start something that had not been thought of before or was neglected before. Did you see yourself in that role? Could you see that pattern in your own life during those years?
Oh, I was reminded of it. The brethren called me a maverick, and some even labeled me as a liberal. And I was on the Review and Herald, a track committee. Being close to the General Conference headquarters, and as the closest conference president, I got assigned to a few committees. So I was on that committee, and their tracks weren't moving. They were dead. They were gathering dust in the book and Bible houses. And I said, brethren, I said, the trouble is they don't win souls. And I said, the reason is they've been written by journalists.
Yeah.
And I said, they need to be written by evangelists.
That's right.
Who are out there in the field winning souls every day.
Yes.
The manager of the Review and Herald really rebuked me. He said, our tracts are written by our editors, and he said they know all the soul-winning phrases. So what can you do? So we started writing and publishing our own tracts. And
was this about the time that you started the Amazing Facts radio broadcast, or?
Well, the Amazing Facts folders came first.
They came before the broadcast.
Yeah, the Amazing Facts folders.
Yeah.
And that was in our response to his blocking, doing it the right way at the publishing
So
house.
you're the person who came up with the name Amazing Facts.
Yes.
And then you put together
Bill May
these...
wrote them.
Bill wrote them.
Yes.
Yeah.
He had a talent for that kind of thing.
He did, didn't he? Well, those tracks were distributed. I'm trying to remember, was there a What Then, or what was it? It was a catchy title.
We had, early on, we had distributed 8 million.
Yeah.
And it's probably doubled or tripled since then.
Oh, yeah.
And it was, at that time, it was the largest circulation of any tracts in the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Right.
Wow.
I'm aware.
Now, again, I want to stop you again, because something else. I'm sure that much of our viewing audience didn't know that Amazing Facts, which is a worldwide ministry, got its genesis right here with this.
Well, it's just one of my children.
Yeah. You've had many, many children.
Yeah.
And that's in response to something, Jim, that wasn't working.
No.
You've got a warehouse full of tracts that nobody wants. And so rather than just wring your hands, somebody said, hey, let's start something on our own that will work.
Right.
Where did the idea of using Amazing Facts as a sort of entering wedge to the gospel, how did that, walk us through that genesis, how that started?
Well, Elder May, when he was in the Texas conference, developed a little tract called This May Startle You,
That's right, yeah.
And it was a cartoon-type tract, about this square, and you'd thumb the pages and different picture and little wording underneath, and it said, this may startle you, but, next page, Sunday's not the Sabbath. And he led them through a direct, hard sell presentation on the Sabbath, and it said, if you want more information on this, send for the book From Sabbath to Sunday by Carlisle B. Haynes.
Yeah.
Well, we got a lot of red-hot interest, people that were interested in the Sabbath. We didn't have to preach to them 2 weeks before we introduced the Sabbath. They wanted it.
Yeah.
So we said, look, Bill, let's write these with a direct, hard sell approach. And he did. And he did a masterful job. The Lord used Bill.
Yes, he did.
Now, it was rather interesting. The General Conference publishing policy was so rigid that nothing could be printed outside of the publishing houses. So you could do it for your own use, but you couldn't sell them.
Yeah.
And that's the way the policies were. And so we started, and we used Don Gray's Gift Bible Evangelism card with the Amazing Facts folders and Don Gray's Gift Bible card. We were getting lots of good interest. And then when we held our crisis hour evangelism meetings, they were reaping meetings, and we were getting more and more baptisms. We were leading North America, percentage-wise, in baptism. And but we couldn't distribute them without getting into trouble with the brethren. And the circulation manager at the Review and Herald said, if we can't stop Miller and May, we are nothing. But so we said, how are we going to do this? Conferences would beg us, share those with us. We said, we can. And they thought we were just sitting on something, hiding something good from them. And finally we said, okay, we'll try this. So we found an Adventist printer in New York City. We used him as a distributor. And we said, he'll be the middleman. You send your orders to New York, and we'll fill them that way. And so we got off the hook. But in getting the price where they were affordable, they were beautiful, full-color, multi-page brochures.
Yeah. Now, there's another innovation. You guys are one of the early guys to go with the full-color thing as opposed to the old. Remember the 27 lesson, I can't remember what it was. It was long, but it was in black and white, and a lot of the material that came off the press was black and white. You decided to go with
the old 20th century Bible course.
Precisely. Right.
We went full color.
Yeah.
We spent $10,000 for the artwork. And we had a special artist, and he farmed it out to other artists. We had deadlines, and he got under pressure and couldn't do it all.
So
it was
really
quite a production.
And I'm stopping you a little, but you were really convicted that this was the way to go. So much so you're spending a lot of money now to get this thing off the ground.
For that little field, $10,000 was a lot of money.
Sure.
Now, publishing them. When it came time to publishing, we found a publisher in the Baltimore, Washington area, and that's a large metro area, competitive business market. And they wanted about $55 a thousand. Well, that was too high for the churches. And so then we scattered the nation, found a press out in Ohio, I believe it was. Had a rotary press. They would do them for $35 a thousand, just to cut it about in half. And we said, that's still a little bit high. And so then we went to the Asia and to Japan. We even went to Red China. And we had some unbelievably low prices in China. And for our gift Bibles, I'll tell about that later. Anyhow, we found a very reputable press called the Nippon Publishing Association. Their headquarters looked like the downtown of a 40,000 population city. And they said they would deliver them on the Baltimore dock for $17 a thousand.
Wow.
And so we went with them. And we had 1 million of those tracts. And that's the first time I discovered that 1 million of anything, sheets of paper or anything, is a lot. Because we sent several of our pastors down there with the conference moving van, and they worked all day trying to get those off the boat, off the dock, bring them out to our warehouse. And that's how we got started.
And amazing facts, that idea caught on evidently very fast right away.
All over. It just the Lord blessed. It was something that the Lord was behind. No question in my mind. All of these things were ordained of God.
Now, you were baptizing, maybe 10% or more of your conference?
10, sometimes 11, 12% annually. And when you do it one year, it's difficult to cap it the next year. And the next year, it's stigmatic, it grows. But the conference grew from about a little over 3,000 to about 6,000 in 6 years, less than 6 years.
Now, about this time, you were starting to talk to Elder H.M.S. Richards Sr. about a daily broadcast.
Oh, yeah. Elder Richards, this goes back to when I was pastoring at Gentry. And when Elder Evans would tell us to put a camp meeting together, Elder Richards came. And Henry Karuba, pastor, a development director in the conference. And I went to see Elder Richards after his preaching service one night at the camp meeting at his motel. And he never turned down young pastors.
No.
And we were just kids. And I said, Elder Richards, you know, I'd been driving around and listening to Herbert W. Armstrong. And I started bumping in. I usually had a large territory with my church districts. And I was bumping into Armstrongites everywhere I went. And I thought, why is he getting so many baptisms and we're not getting very many? So I began to analyze it. And I said, we're Voice of Prophecy is weekly, they're daily. If you miss a Voice of Prophecy, it's 2 weeks before you hear him again. If you miss Armstrong, you hear him tomorrow night. Or if you just switch the dial and
hear him again,
you can hear him again later that night. So, repetition. I thought repetition. Then I noticed some other characteristics that were different. I said Armstrong uses the direct hard sell approach. And he attracts secular people, whereas Elder Richards is the indirect preaching approach. Armstrong came on like a newscaster. Richards came on like a preacher. And then I noticed another one. The Voice of Prophecy was, Armstrong was like a newscast and had a lot of vital information. Never had a prayer. Never had a hymn. It appealed to secular people. Voice of Prophecy was like a little chapel of the air. Hymns and prayers and bells and chimes. And you felt like you're going to church. Secular people would turn the dial when they heard that. Wherever they heard Armstrong, it pulled them in. So I said, we need that kind of broadcast. So I told Elder Richards that night after camp meeting. He said, Brother Miller, he said, you'll be happy to learn that we're starting a daily broadcast. I said, amen.
Amen. Well, listen, we're going to get back and hear the rest of the story about the daily broadcast, and you stay with us because you're also going to hear how Amazing Facts became the media power that it has become. How it started out in radio, and our guest today, Elder Cyril Miller, was the man who came up with this concept. You stay with us, and we'll be right back right after this.